Hey, Ioana.
Hi, Tim.
So the topic of today is virtual and remote leadership. Obviously, a massive amount of discussion has been had over this over the last 4 years with COVID and the pandemic. And today it continues in the back to work or back to office systems that are being created or, so it's an important topic.
So we're going to look at some of the ideas that came during our webinars and discussions with participants and some of our own. But I would like to go a little bit deeper into what all these represent or mean. So when we talk about increasing your one-on-ones or the quantity of spontaneous individual communications, what do we mean by that exactly?
So this means a lot of leaders realize when they start working and leading remote teams that the quantity of their one-to-one discussions decreases. They very quickly get to a mode where they're only running one-to-ones every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, and in some companies even less. And so, we've been very lucky over the past 4 years because we have had a lot of work with technical organizations where the appreciation and the desire to use a virtual working model is greater and higher than in other areas. But one of the things that does get really impacted is the quantity of one-to-ones. So heads up for all leaders. Make sure that the quantity of one-to-ones doesn't suffer. But this doesn't mean that you need to have, one-to-ones, half an hour one-to-ones, 45-minute one-to-ones on a weekly basis. So getting back to your cadence core principles of doing, check-ins, a 10-minute one-to-one on a weekly basis to understand, what the priorities are, where people need support may well be enough, but don't let it slip completely.
You were used to hold a one-on-one every week for an hour or every month for an hour with each member of your team. We would expect you to do the same virtually. But the thing is this, if you do the following, if you prepare 4 questions for each one-on-one that both you and your team members know about, then they will come prepared to the meeting. So you will have more control over it, and you will be able to shorten the time that you used to spend on these kind of meetings. Yeah. So preparation is very important.
Preparation and consistency of the type of meeting that you're running. And, one of the other things that we were told many times was to try and do this. Whatever you're doing face-to-face, try and do it online as well. So stick to your structures, stick to your principles, stick to your the way that you would do it in a face-to-face environment, and try and replicate that whenever possible.
Okay, let's talk about team first, making sure your team always gets your priority.
A great example is the example of the middle manager who, thrown into a virtual world, they all of a sudden start giving all of their attention to their managers rather than their teams, which is a very natural thing because, the attention is going to go where the biggest noise comes from. And so making sure your team always gets priority is something that is not just a virtual thing, but it is crystallized and brought to the surface when you're working virtually and remote. The fact that your center of attention will shift from working with your people to pleasing your bosses. And that's the danger that we want leads to avoid.
And how about meeting management, becoming more conscious of the way you run your meetings?
In a face-to-face environment, you can be lazy. And everybody can be lazy. At the end of the day, everybody gets into the meeting. They're there. It's like, hey, how you doing? Good. Do you have a good weekend? Blah, blah. So there's an automatic entry into the small talk. And the small talk can be used to cover any number of sins on a meeting management level. A virtual environment means that the quality of the structure of your meetings and the way that they're run and the various tools that you're using to run them and the consistency of those meetings is much, much more visible, because there's much less desire to do the small talk and social interaction, which means the actual structure of the meeting does get assessed by everybody in a much harsher and harder light.
And when we talk about checkpoints, so establishing checkpoints in the middle of the day, do we talk about very short discussions, like 1 or 2 minutes discussions?
This was highlighted, yes, exactly. And this was highlighted with a very specific example of onboarding new colleagues in a remote and virtual environment. And how many touch points do the new colleagues need, especially at the beginning of their careers or the beginning of their jobs? And, best practice, or really good practice, don't want to call it best practice, was where team leads were establishing anything up to 4 checkpoints during the day, so that they were kicking people off with the work that they had to do for the day. And then there would be an 11, a 1, a 3, and a 5, 5-minute checkpoints, just allowing people to keep up with, am I doing the right thing? Should I be focusing on something else? I had a question about this, a question about that. And so that's the checkpoint, which I think is a brilliant thing to be able to do, but it does, go against what most leaders are able to do, because their own timetables are, chock-a-block full of other meetings. So massively difficult to do that one, but a great thing to be able to do, especially within the context of new, younger colleagues.
Probably in the forming stage of a team would work.
Mm-hmm. And exactly. And you remember our example in the forming stage where leaders will ask new hires to interview experienced team members for a 6-week period, once or twice a week for 6 weeks, interviewing the same people again and again and again. What do you do? How will I start integrating with what you do? What are your expectations of me? How does it fit in? And so that process is exactly what this checkpoint means.
And when we talk about socializing, this is a tough one in a remote environment. Thinking about the way that your team socializes and trying to increase that socializing in a virtual environment. How do you do that?
There is no one answer. And I would say at the outset, what is your desire of socializing yourself? My own preference is, to socialize during the day and during meetings, not to do any extra curricular socializing at all. And I know a lot of people who think the same way. But of course, there are thousands and thousands of team leads who will take their teams for beers or go team building or doing various online competitions after work, and the list is endless. So I think the question here is, just giving some thought to how do we socialize with each other, and where do we get that social potential? Yeah, because when you move into a remote leadership and remote working environment, all of a sudden it seems that the only thing that is left is the work, and there's no space for the socializing anymore. And so the call out for leads is think about the way that your team socializes, the way that they want to socialize, and create space and time for that to happen in whatever way that happens to be.
Yeah, I have a good example here. When I was working for a company a while back and COVID hit, everybody was at home and we were just trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? This is going to be crazy. We've never done this before. And what we did is organized 1-hour session per week where everyone would join, or whoever wanted to join. So it was a mandatory. Yeah, it was just a socializing event online, where everyone would join with a glass of wine or a beer or soda or whatever they preferred, and just communicate, just ask how have you been, and we were in maybe groups of 20 or 30 people, but it really went quite well for the first, I think, 6 or 8 weeks of pandemic.
Great example. And I work with a group of salespeople. Admittedly, they are all in the same time zone, so it does make it possible. And there are 16 salespeople, and they meet every morning at 8:30 in an online meeting. And the meeting lead has preset up the breakout rooms so that people instantly go into a breakout room. And so they're in a breakout room of 3 or 4 people, and it's voluntary as well, but they always go. They're always there. And it's a highly valuable piece of the process for them. And they get a lot of stuff done within that socializing piece at the beginning of the day. And sales is a lot about, individual motivation and keeping the mojo going, keeping the fires burning. And so the reps use that as a way to kind of connect with people that get being challenged by the same difficult environment as they are. Mm. And there's a lot of empathy created within that session. What does the lead do? Nothing. He's one of the breakout rooms. So he's in one of the breakout rooms himself. And then they'll switch and rotate the breakout rooms after 15 minutes. But they have the opportunity to get back into their original room as well. And then they end up all together for the final 5 minutes before 9, and they all enter into their sales work.
I have to agree, breakout rooms are probably one of the most valuable tools that are often ignored in meetings.
Most leaders don't feel comfortable about doing it. We literally make a mandatory recommendation to begin any meeting over 40 minutes long with a 5-minute breakout room at the beginning in groups of 2, and give them a content-related question if you need to, or give them just the task of saying, how are you doing? How was your day? What's your view of this particular topic? And obviously for, meetings which benefit from that. And the reality is that all meetings benefit from it. So, yeah, cameras on is quite an important one as well. But yeah, again, it's pushing it through as a leader. It's one of those things that you just need to do. Like a Chinese water torture technique. You never get bored of saying, cameras on, please, cameras on.
Yeah, I've seen leaders establish from the very beginning which meetings require a camera on and which meetings don't require a camera on. So they create a sort of a flexibility around it, but in particular lines. What I noticed, and you can imagine if you are in a meeting and your camera is off, then the whole communication process quality is lower because there's no body language, there's no facial expressions, there's nothing. It's only your tone of voice and your intonation.
And as we had very clearly from our train the trainer examples, during COVID, the best teachers, used the simplest tools, cameras on, breakout rooms, and question lists. And literally a list of questions that they would put into the students during the lessons. Students hated it because, it's like, oh, teacher's going to ask me a question. But they were concentrating and they were focused.
Okay, so keeping the lines open, having, for instance, a 4-hour constant bandwidth dropout, this sounds a lot like establishing checkpoints, but it's a different kind of making yourself available.
This is a very, 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 very tough thing to implement. In terms of it's hard to implement it. And the effect is quite electric. I got it from 2 different sources. I have a company that I work with, and good friend in the UK. It's a group of barristers, and the office is run by a group of clerks and a lead clerk. And at the beginning of COVID, they sold their building in London. They went online. And now the organization is a 100% online organization. And when they began it, they were looking for a bit of advice on how to do this. So they set up an online meeting for Monday morning, and they arrived at 8:30. And the other people, the meeting attendees, were saying, "So how are we going to do this? When does this meeting end?" The lead said, "Well, it doesn't end. It ends at 5:30 this evening." And they said, "Okay, well, what about tomorrow? That's a long meeting. What about tomorrow?" She said, "Same thing. 8:30 till 5:30, one meeting. Arrive in the morning, leave in the evening." And they said, "Okay, what, every day? Yeah. For how long are we going to do this? Forever." What's the question for? When we worked in London, we arrived in the morning, we left in the evening. Nothing's changed. We arrive in the morning, we leave in the evening. Nothing's changed. So, of course, people go out into their own meetings during the day, but there is a central point of contact where the team is expected to be all the time. And we've been working with hundreds of leaders. There's maybe 1 out of 200 people who has got the guts to initiate this. And I really do mean guts, because that's a direct mechanism. Yeah. But it doesn't, once it's established, it's just business as usual. People communicate in exactly the same way that they communicate in the office. There's lots of chit-chat going back and forth. Yeah. People, feel absolutely comfortable in saying whatever they need to say. You have small talk constantly. You have smaller meetings happening in different areas. You get that sorted out. And I asked this lead where she got the idea from, and she said her son, who was a gamer, so he was online gaming for hours with his friends, and they were constantly online together for like 3-4 hours. They were online, and she said, and they were so motivated, having so much fun, and playing their games. They had a group that was constantly together, and so she said, well, if they can do it, then there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do the same thing. But of course, this has a big relationship to, what is your leadership style? What do you think you can do with your people? What do you think they will accept? The level of directness that you have to bring in at the beginning to get it established, which allows you then to become more cooperative with the way that it works.
How about relying on verbal versus written? Not letting people read between the lines. What does that refer to?
A lot of virtual communication, virtual leadership means that you have to rely on written communication a lot. You do need to have more discussions on the quality of written communication. And you do need to get on the phone more often and speak to people and make sure that the written is supported by the verbal. But there are many people who will disagree with this, with a lot of good reason as well. And the topic of asynchronous communication, which is basically writing a very, very good report of what you need, so that people can work with that, is a valid difference to this, what is here. For the majority of leads, it simply means, send the mail and then pick up the phone and give it a bit of verbal description as well to ensure that the mail is read in the right way. I think the final one is just this hybrid thing. A lot of leads struggle with, back to office structures or initiatives, end up running hybrid moderation, and hybrid is really, really difficult. So there is many more that we could say about this, but the quick recommendation is don't do it. Even if you've got 5 people in the office, send them to their own laptops to connect with the 5 people who are in their own offices in different parts of the country or world, so that it creates a virtual meeting out of it, because hybrid really is very, very difficult to manage in an effective way.
So giving people perspective of when the next face-to-face will be. I'm thinking about this in terms of sometimes you need to talk to your leader face to face for particular topics, and you have to know when that will happen.
Yeah. And I mean, we have our next face-to-face perspective in front of us in terms of our next session in April, which is already quite good as a kind of milestone in order to say, what do we need to achieve by that time to make sure that that face-to-face works well? And I would say that this is for virtual and remote teams, even if that perspective is 6 months or 9 months or 12 months in advance, the perspective of the face-to-face still has a lot of value. So, great. So lots of topics around the topic of virtual and remote leadership. Try and make sure that the interest level and interaction level stays as high as possible at all times. Think about your timing. Make some good long-term plans. A frequent discussion of tools like Relationship Map and Leadership Cockpit can be very, very beneficial. Get your frequency right. And as my personal favorite, whatever you're doing face-to-face, try and do it online as well, and make the consistency of your leadership come across whenever you can.
Keep flexibility in terms of try new things and try as many things as possible to see what works for you and your team.
And get feedback to it.